The sun rose slowly over the dry ridges of red rock, painting the sky in streaks of gold and scarlet, but the day felt heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. Inside the Whitmore ranch house, Clara Whitmore stood before the cracked mirror of her mother's old dressing table, hands trembling as she tried to braid her hair. At 19, she had imagined this moment, the day she would wear white, the day she'd walk down an aisle, but never like this. Her father's boots thudded against the wooden floorboards downstairs, each step a reminder of the bargain she had no power to break. Thomas Whitmore, once a respected cattle rancher, had gambled everything, his land, his herds, and his name. Now, to keep what little remained, he had agreed to a marriage no one in Red Rock could stomach. His only daughter, wed to an Apache warrior. The words had been simple, but they shattered Clara's world when she first heard them. "You'll marry him, Clara," her father said, his voice hard as dry oak. "It's the only way the ranch survives." She had stood frozen, her throat aching with disbelief. Marry him? An Apache? He hadn't looked at her. "You'll do as you're told." "He's a man of honor." Better that than ruin. Honor. The word burned in her chest. What honor was there in forcing her to wed a stranger? A man the town called a savage. Yet her father's debts were deep, and Chief Taza, the Apache leader who had rescued the town's cattle from outlaws months earlier, had offered peace and protection in exchange for a union, a bridge between their worlds. It was politics disguised as matrimony. Outside, the church bell began to ring. Clara's mother had died when she was 12, leaving her with faded notions of love and decency. Since then, she had learned to obey quietly, to hide her tears, to keep her chin lifted when the world pushed her down. But as she stood before the mirror, the reflection staring back at her no longer looked like a girl. It looked like someone walking toward exile. The knock at the door made her flinch. It was Mrs. Cartwright, the preacher's wife, carrying a borrowed white dress that smelled faintly of cedar and age. "You're brave, child," she murmured, though her eyes were filled with pity. Clara managed a nod, too numb to answer. When she stepped out into the open, the entire town seemed to have gathered. Men leaned on hitching posts. Women whispered behind gloved hands. The air was thick with dust and judgment. She felt their eyes burning holes in her skin. They saw her not as a bride, but as a warning. At the far end of the street stood Taza, tall and still as stone. His presence was quiet but commanding. Black hair bound with leather, eyes like storm clouds over desert rock. He wore no suit, no tie, only ceremonial leather adorned with turquoise and silver. Even the sheriff, a man who'd fought against the Apache years ago, looked uneasy in his presence. When Clara reached him, her steps slow and measured, she refused to lift her eyes. She could feel his gaze, though, steady, unflinching. The preacher began the vows, his voice quivering. Words like honor, unity, and peace floated through the air like dying embers. "Do you take this man?" Clara's lips trembled. "I do." The sound came out like a whisper broken by wind. "Do you take this woman?" "I do," Taza said simply, his deep voice calm, unforced. When he reached for her hand, she braced herself. But instead of the roughness she expected, his touch was gentle, steady, almost protective. It startled her more than anger ever could. For one heartbeat, she met his eyes. There was no triumph in them. No mockery, only a quiet understanding, as if he, too, recognized that both of them were prisoners of other men's bargains. The crowd began to murmur when he placed a single white feather into her hand, a traditional Apache gesture of peace and fidelity. Clara didn't understand its meaning, but she felt its weight, light yet profound. As they turned to face the onlookers, the town fell into an uneasy silence. Somewhere a child began to cry, and the wind carried the sound across the dry street like a lament. Clara wanted to cry too, but she stood tall, chin lifted, hand still holding the feather. She didn't yet know it. But that feather, the first gift from her new husband, would one day symbolize something far greater than a forced marriage. It would become the first quiet ripple in a story that would shake the entire town to its core. The day of Clara Whitmore's wedding dawned cloudless, cruelly beautiful, like a sky that refused to mourn. The air shimmered with heat rising from the dry earth, and every sound seemed sharp. The squeak of wagon wheels, the creak of porch boards, the whispers of townsfolk too eager to witness a scandal. The church stood at the edge of Red Rock, a small white structure half swallowed by dust and sunlight. It had seen funerals, christenings, and a handful of weddings, but never one like this. Never a wedding that split the town so cleanly between curiosity and contempt. Inside, Clara stood alone near the back, her white dress clinging awkwardly in the heat. The borrowed lace felt heavy, suffocating. She had pinned the single feather Taza had given her into her hair that morning. She wasn't sure why. Maybe out of defiance, maybe out of strange respect. The feather swayed slightly whenever she breathed, as if it were the only thing in the room alive enough to move. Her father entered, face drawn, eyes shadowed from sleepless nights. He had refused to meet her gaze since the deal was made. Now, as he offered her his arm, she saw guilt flicker there, just a spark, quickly buried beneath pride. "Best we get it done," he muttered. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. The sound of the church bell rolled across the valley, summoning everyone within earshot. By the time they stepped outside, the dusty street was lined with people. The men had taken off their hats out of habit, but their expressions carried no reverence. The women watched from behind fans, pretending not to stare, pretending they didn't whisper. At the far end of the street, Taza waited. He stood motionless beneath the rising sun, dressed in ceremonial Apache attire, soft buckskin, turquoise-studded armbands, and a leather sash marked with silver medallions. The contrast between him and the town was striking. He belonged to the earth, to wind and flame, while they stood in stiff collars in judgment. His stillness commanded more respect than any uniform or title could. When Clara reached him, the crowd fell quiet. The preacher cleared his throat nervously, holding a Bible that shook in his hands. "Dearly beloved," he began, though the word beloved felt hollow in the heavy air. "We are gathered here in the sight of God." His voice wavered as he glanced between them, an English girl in white lace and an Apache warrior whose expression revealed nothing. Clara felt a bead of sweat slide down her neck. The air seemed too thick to breathe. Every heartbeat sounded like the ticking of a clock marking the end of one life and the reluctant beginning of another. When it came time for the vows, the preacher's gaze fell on her. "Do you, Clara Whitmore, take this man?" Her throat tightened. For a moment she couldn't speak. Then quietly, "I do." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. The preacher turned to Taza. "Do you, Chief Taza, take this woman?" "I do," he said simply. His voice carried through the air, deep, resonant, certain. Then came the moment to exchange tokens. Clara expected a ring, but instead Taza reached into a small leather pouch and withdrew a second white feather. This one streaked faintly with red. He placed it in her hand. "This," he said in measured English, "means life joined with courage. 2 hearts, 1 wind." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some gasped, some scoffed, others fell silent. Clara's fingers closed around the feather, feeling its softness against her palm. When the preacher declared them husband and wife, there was no applause. Only the sound of wind moving over the plains. Taza offered his hand. Hesitant, she took it. His grip was firm but not forceful. As they turned toward the waiting people, she heard whispers. "Savage wedding." "Poor girl." God help her, but Taza didn't react. He looked only at her, his gaze calm and unwavering. For a fleeting moment, Clara thought she saw something unexpected in his eyes. Respect, not the pity or possession she had braced for, but quiet recognition. As they walked through the crowd, the townsfolk parted reluctantly. Dust swirled around their feet. Somewhere the preacher's wife began to hum a hymn, her voice trembling but pure. By the time they reached the end of the street, the church bell rang again, once, twice, then fell silent. Clara glanced back. Every face behind her was still, every mouth closed. The people of Red Rock had come to see disgrace, to witness a humiliation. Instead, they had seen something they couldn't name, a ceremony both strange and solemn, an Apache warrior whose dignity silenced them without a word. And as the wind lifted the feathers in her hair, Clara felt the faintest stirrings of something she hadn't expected at all. Not love. Not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Red Rock changed overnight. Before the wedding, Clara Whitmore had been Thomas Whitmore's girl, quiet, polite, a little proud, but respected. After it, she became something else entirely. People didn't use her name anymore. They called her that Apache's wife, or worse, whispered the white squaw when they thought she couldn't hear. The first morning after the wedding, Clara stepped into town to buy flour from Dugan's general store. The bell over the door jingled, but the sound died in the heavy silence that followed. Dugan's wife, who had known Clara since childhood, froze behind the counter, her hand hovering over the scale. "What can I get you, Mrs. Whitmore?" she began, then corrected herself awkwardly. "Or should I say, Mrs. Taza?" Clara's stomach tightened. "Just flour, please." The woman hesitated, eyes darting toward the few customers in the store. Two men stood by the window pretending to look at horseshoes, but their smirk said otherwise. "I'm afraid we're out," the shopkeeper said finally, though 3 sacks sat in plain view behind her. Clara's gaze lingered on the flour. She wanted to argue, to shout, but her pride held her tongue. She turned quietly and walked out, hearing one of the men chuckle. Outside, the dusty air hit her like heat from a forge. Every face she passed seemed to turn away. Women she'd shared Sunday pews with crossed to the other side of the street. The sheriff gave her a curt nod, as if politeness toward her might cost him something. At home, she said nothing. Taza sat by the open window, sharpening a hunting knife, the rhythm of stone against metal calm and unhurried. His silence filled the small house like a presence of its own. "You went to town," he said without looking up. "Yes." He nodded once. "They do not welcome you." Clara froze. His English was careful, accented, but clear. You knew?" "I knew before we married," he said simply. "They hate what they do not understand." Her temper flared. "Then why agree to this? Why let them mock you and me?" Taza set the knife down and looked at her fully. "Your father made a promise. I keep promises." It wasn't the answer she expected. There was no bitterness in his tone, no pride, just quiet conviction. It frustrated her more than anger would have. "I didn't choose this," she whispered. He studied her for a long moment. "Neither did I," he said, then rose and stepped outside, disappearing into the desert light. For days he left before dawn, returning only after sunset. Clara didn't know where he went, but he always came back with dust on his boots and silence in his eyes. Sometimes he brought meat, sometimes water from the canyon spring, always enough for both of them. At night she sat by the window, listening to the coyotes cry beyond the hills, and wondered if he regretted her as much as she resented him. Then, one afternoon, the cruelty took a sharper edge. She was passing the churchyard when she overheard Mrs. Cartwright and 2 others speaking. "It's a disgrace," one whispered. "A white girl living with a savage. She could have run," another said. "If she wanted to," Mrs. Cartwright sighed. "The Lord tests us all. Maybe he means for her to suffer for her father's sins." Clara froze, the word slicing clean through her. Suffer. The word stayed with her all the way home. That night, Taza found her sitting by the hearth, eyes red but unbroken. He said nothing, only set a small bundle of herbs beside her. "For burns," he said quietly. "You were in the sun too long." She took the herbs, realizing his small kindnesses were the only ones she received anymore. The thought stung, and yet softened her somehow. Weeks passed. The town's cruelty became a kind of constant noise, something she learned to live beside. And yet she began to notice things she hadn't before. The way Taza never raised his voice. The way he shared every bit of food, even when he must have been hungrier. The way he always left her space, never forcing closeness, never demanding gratitude. He treated her not as a wife won through trade, but as someone whose respect he hoped to earn in time. It confused her. It humbled her. One evening, after he returned from a long ride, she asked where he went each day. He smiled faintly. "To learn the land around your town," he said. "If I must live among those who hate me, I should know the ground they stand on." For the first time, Clara saw something new in him. Not just endurance, but a quiet kind of strength, deeper than pride. The town could not break him, and perhaps, she thought, neither would it break her. She didn't know it yet, but this long season of cruelty was not meant to destroy her. It was meant to prepare her for the storm that was coming, and for the truth she would one day have to defend before the very people who now turned away from her. The morning Taza asked Clara to ride with him, the world was still and sun-soaked. The air shimmered above the sand, and a faint wind carried the scent of sagebrush and dust. Clara was standing at the edge of their small homestead, hanging laundry on a crooked line, when his voice broke the silence behind her. "Ride with me today," he said. She turned, startled. He rarely spoke more than a few words at a time and never offered requests. Why? His expression didn't change. You should know the land you live on. Clara hesitated. She had spent weeks wrapped in resentment and shame, avoiding both him and the outside world. The thought of riding into the desert with him felt both dangerous and strange. But something in his calm, his complete lack of expectation, unnerved her. All right, she said finally. They set out just after noon. Taza rode ahead on a black stallion that moved with silent grace. Clara followed on her old mare, feeling the heat rise off the earth in waves. The town disappeared behind them, swallowed by dust and distance, until all that remained was the sound of hoofbeats and the endless horizon. The desert stretched wide, beautiful in its emptiness, fierce in its silence. Jagged mesas broke the skyline like the bones of the earth. Every shadow seemed alive. Every gust of wind whispered through the rocks like an ancient voice. Taza rode as though he belonged to it, part of the landscape itself. Occasionally he would stop and gesture toward something, a hawk circling high above, a snake gliding silently across the sand, the faint tracks of deer near a dry creek bed. The desert remembers everything, he said once. Every footstep, every drop of blood, every prayer whispered into the wind. Clara didn't answer, but the words stayed with her. When they reached a cluster of red cliffs, he dismounted and motioned for her to follow. The climb was steep, the rocks warm beneath her hands. When they reached the top, the world opened before them, a vast sea of color and stone. In the distance, a ribbon of green marked where the river cut through the canyon, shimmering faintly in the sun. Taza pointed toward it. That is where my people go when they pray. Water is life. We offer thanks there. Clara gazed at it, breath catching in her chest. She had seen rivers before, but never like this. Hidden, sacred, protected by silence and distance. It's beautiful, she whispered. He nodded, his expression unreadable. The land gives, but it also takes. We live because we respect it. As they stood there, the wind lifted her hair, tangling it across her face. She turned to look at him, really look. His features were carved by sun and endurance, but there was gentleness in the way he watched the land, as though it were something fragile, alive. You love this place, she said quietly. Yes. His eyes met hers. It is my mother, my teacher, my home. Something in the simplicity of that struck her deeply. She thought of her father's ranch, how the land there had always been something to control, to break, to own. For Taza, it was something to belong to. They rested near the canyon's edge, where a small spring bubbled from the rocks, cold and clear. Taza cupped his hands and offered her water. She hesitated, then drank. It tasted like the earth itself, wild, ancient, pure. As the sun began to sink, painting the sky in fire and gold, Taza spoke again. You think I am your jailer, he said, not accusingly, just stating a truth. Clara stiffened. You're not? He shook his head. No. The ones who hate what they don't understand, they are the jailers. They chain their own hearts, she had no reply. His words, quiet and steady, felt like stones dropped into a still pond, rippling through everything she believed. The ride home was silent. The light faded and the first stars began to pierce the indigo sky. Clara found herself glancing at him now and then, not in fear but in curiosity. He had not touched her, not demanded her obedience, not even asked for her trust. Yet somehow he had given her something she didn't know she had lost: perspective. When they reached home, he dismounted first, tying the horses to the post. Tomorrow, he said, I go to the canyon to bring water. You can come again if you wish. She didn't answer right away. She only looked at the desert, vast and infinite, the same desert that had once seemed her prison. Now, for the first time, it looked like a place that might set her free. I'll come, she said softly. Taza nodded once, then disappeared into the shadows. And that night, under the same stars that watched over the canyons, Clara lay awake, her heart quiet but restless, knowing that something in her had begun to shift. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that looked a lot like respect. The desert had been still for weeks, too still, the kind of silence that warned of change. The sky grew heavy, clouds gathering like dark bruises over the horizon. When the storm came, it came without mercy. That morning, Clara woke to the smell of rain and the low, distant roll of thunder. She stood by the doorway, watching the horizon split open with flashes of light. Taza was already saddling the horses, his movements deliberate, focused. "A storm's coming," she said. He looked up briefly. Yes, a strong one. There was no fear in his voice, only awareness. To him, storms were part of the world's rhythm, a cleansing, not a curse. But to Clara, raised among ranchers who prayed against every sign of thunder, it meant danger. By noon, the wind was howling. Sheets of rain swept across the plains, turning the hard earth into rivers of mud. Clara struggled to close the shutters against the gusts, her hair soaked and whipping across her face. Taza secured the roof beams and tied down the horses, his shirt plastered to his skin. Through the roar of the storm, she thought she heard something else, a faint, rhythmic pounding that wasn't thunder. "Hoofbeats. Taza," she called. "Do you hear that?" He paused, listening. His eyes narrowed. Riders. Within moments, the truth became clear. A band of men, settlers from Red Rock, half-drunk and filled with hatred, had ridden toward the Apache camp at the edge of town. Clara could see them faintly through the rain, torches in the wind, small flames battling the downpour. Her blood ran cold. "They'll set fire to the camp," she whispered. Taza's jaw tightened. "I told the sheriff this might happen." He grabbed his rifle and mounted his horse. Clara ran after him. "You can't go alone." "I must," he said simply. "Then I'm coming with you." He turned to her, rain dripping from his hair. "It will be dangerous." "I don't care." For the first time he hesitated, not out of doubt but something like respect. Then he handed her the reins of her mare. "Stay close to me." The ride through the storm was chaos. Wind tore at them, lightning split the sky in blinding streaks. The rain came so hard it stung their faces like needles. But Clara didn't falter. She rode just behind him, heart hammering, her dress heavy with mud. When they reached the camp, flames already licked the edges of the tents. The outlaws, 5 or 6 men, were shouting, drunk on anger and whiskey. Children cried. Women scrambled to pull blankets and baskets away from the fire. Taza dismounted and moved with speed that stunned her. He shouted something in Apache, short, commanding, and the people obeyed, forming lines to douse the flames with sand and water. Clara jumped from her horse, grabbing a blanket and slapping at the fire until her hands burned. The men turned when they saw her. "Well, look who's here," one of them sneered. The preacher's daughter herself, come to play squaw for real. Before she could move, Taza was there. He struck the man's torch from his hand and sent him sprawling into the mud. The others backed away, startled by the fury in his eyes. Not wild, but controlled, sharp as steel. "Go," Taza said, voice low and deadly calm. "You bring fire again. I bring blood." The men hesitated, then retreated, their courage melting faster than the rain could drown it. When they were gone, Clara helped the women smother the last of the flames. Smoke and rain mixed in the air, acrid and heavy. The camp was a ruin of wet ashes and scorched tents, but no one had died. Not one. Taza stood motionless, chest heaving, watching the last smoke curl upward. Clara stepped beside him, her hands trembling. "You saved them," she said softly. He turned to her. "We saved them." For a moment, the world was quiet, just the sound of rain easing, drops falling into puddles, the faint crying of a child. Taza looked at Clara then, his gaze steady but changed. "You are not weak," he said. "You fight with heart." Her throat tightened. She had never been praised like that before, not for her courage, not by anyone. They stayed until dawn, helping rebuild what they could. By the time the sun rose, the clouds had scattered, leaving the desert washed clean and bright. Smoke curled faintly in the morning air, but the worst had passed. When they finally rode back toward Red Rock, the town was stirring, faces peeking from windows. People stared as Clara rode beside Taza, mud-streaked, soaked, her eyes fierce and unashamed. The whispers began immediately. Was she there? With the Apaches? She fought beside him. But for once, Clara didn't care. The storm had taken her fear with it, and in its wake she found something new. Something stronger than pride, freer than shame, not love. Not yet, but trust, and in the dry, pale light of morning, as Taza handed her the reins, she realized that trust in a world so divided was the rarest gift of all. The storm had passed, but the aftermath left deeper scars than the fire ever could. For 3 days, Red Rock buzzed with talk, half-truths, rumors, and poisonous curiosity. The story spread faster than the flames that had nearly destroyed the Apache camp. Clara Whitmore had fought beside her husband, shoulder to shoulder with the savages. At first, people spoke of it in whispers. By the end of the week, the whispers turned into open stares. Clara could feel their eyes on her every time she rode into town. The same people who once pitied her now treated her as something foreign, an outsider who had crossed an invisible line. Even the preacher who had married them refused to meet her eyes on Sunday. When she walked into Dugan's general store, the old man behind the counter cleared his throat and said flatly, "We don't serve his kind." She set her basket down slowly. "I'm not asking for his kind. I'm asking for flour." Dugan shifted uneasily. "It's all the same to me." For a moment, Clara just stood there. The old version of herself, the frightened girl who once lowered her eyes and walked away, was gone. The woman who faced him now had survived fire, storm, and shame. "Then I'll take nothing from you," she said quietly, turning to leave. "But one day when your children come thirsty to my husband's well, remember this moment." He blinked, confused, not yet understanding. Outside, the air shimmered with heat, the desert reclaiming its stillness. But in that stillness, something was shifting, not just in Clara, but in the town itself. That evening, Taza sat near the doorway, repairing a saddle strap. His hands worked steadily, calm as always, while Clara stirred beans over the fire. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was companionable, filled with unspoken things that didn't need naming. "They talk," he said after a long moment. "They always talk," she replied. He gave a faint smile. "Yes, but now they talk because they see what they fear. A woman who stands with her husband." Clara looked at him. "And what do you see?" He met her gaze evenly. "I see a woman who has stopped being afraid of them." The words sank deep. She didn't reply, but her heart warmed with a quiet pride she hadn't known she could feel. A few days later, Taza took her to the edge of the Apache settlement. The camp had been rebuilt, new hides stretched, fresh fires burning. The children ran barefoot through the dust, laughing, their faces bright against the red light of evening. When they saw Clara, they waved shyly. Taza spoke to one of the elders, an older woman named Nakai, whose eyes shone with wisdom and mischief. Nakai handed Clara a woven basket filled with maize and smiled. "For you," she said in accented English. "The chief's woman helped save our home. That makes you sister to all." Clara blinked back tears. For weeks she had been shunned by her own people. But here, among strangers, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Belonging. That night, she sat by the fire with Taza and the elders, listening to stories of the desert, how the wind carried memory, how the stars were the eyes of ancestors watching over the living. She understood only fragments, but she felt the weight of meaning in every word. Later, as they rode home beneath a sky silvered with moonlight, she said softly, "Your people treat me better than my own." Taza's reply was simple. "Then perhaps you are beginning to understand what my people means." But back in Red Rock, the whispers had grown into something darker. Some townsmen, those who had led the attack on the camp, were angry that Taza hadn't retaliated. His restraint made them look small. The sheriff, caught between keeping peace and keeping votes, warned Clara's father that tensions were rising. Thomas Whitmore came to her door one evening, hat in hand, pride swallowed by worry. "Clara," he said gruffly, "this thing you're doing, living with him, standing up for him, it's making life harder for everyone." "Everyone?" she asked. "Or just for you?" Her father sighed. "You don't understand, these people won't forgive. You can't change who he is." She stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "No, father, but I can change who I am." For a moment, the old man just stared at her, the weight of his choices reflected in her eyes. Then he tipped his hat and walked away, his boots heavy in the dust. The next morning, Clara rode into town again. The stares were there, but softer now, curious rather than cruel. Some women nodded faintly. A few children waved. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. But it was something like the beginning of it. Red Rock was changing, slowly, grudgingly, but undeniably. And deep down, Clara knew. When hearts began to shift, no force on earth could turn them back. The storm had tested them. The fire had revealed them. Now came the part that would define them all, the gift that would silence the town forever. The day began with a stillness so complete that even the desert seemed to hold its breath. The sun rose pale and watchful over Red Rock, casting long shadows through the canyon, as if it too sensed something momentous was about to happen. Clara woke before dawn. Taza was already gone, his side of the bed cool. Outside she found him saddling his horse, a bundle tied behind the saddle. "Where are you going?" she asked. He looked up, his expression unreadable in the half-light. "To finish what I began," he said. "To give you what is yours." Before she could ask more, he swung onto his horse and rode toward the mountains, his dark figure swallowed by the rising dust. Clara stood in the yard long after he disappeared. Something in his tone, a gravity that felt both proud and sorrowful, made her uneasy. Taza didn't return that day, nor the next. By the third morning, townsfolk began to whisper again. Some said he'd gone back to his people. Others claimed he'd left her for good. Clara ignored them all, though her hands trembled when she drew water from the well. Just before dusk, she heard hoofbeats, slow, steady, and familiar. She rushed outside. Taza rode into the yard, his horse dusted with red earth. Behind him on a travois lay a massive stone slab wrapped in blankets. Its weight bowed the wooden frame. Clara stared. "What is that?" Taza dismounted, his eyes calm but shining with pride. "Your wedding gift," he said simply. He untied the coverings, revealing a polished stone, black as obsidian, veined with white streaks that shimmered like lightning. Carved into its face was an intricate design, 2 hands joined in a circle of sun rays and feathers. Beneath it, etched deep, were 2 names, Taza and Clara Whitmore, written in both Apache symbols and English letters. Clara's breath caught. "You carved this?" He nodded. "The stone comes from the sacred ridge. Only a chief's hand may take from it. It is the heart of our people. We give such stones to mark peace or to bind souls." Her eyes filled with tears. "It's beautiful." Taza studied her for a long moment. "Not all in Red Rock will see it that way. But truth does not need their eyes to exist." He lifted the stone carefully, setting it in the open space beside their cabin where the morning light would strike it first each day. As he worked, Clara noticed something else, a small pouch tied at the base of the slab. "What's that?" she asked. He untied it and handed it to her. Inside lay several folded papers, parchments sealed and stamped. Clara opened one and gasped. It was a deed, a legal transfer of land, signed and witnessed. Taza's name appeared beside her own. He spoke softly. "Half this land, your land, belongs to you alone. No man can take it, not even me. That is my gift," Clara's voice broke. "Why would you do this?" He looked toward the town shimmering on the horizon. "Because one day when they see your name beside mine, they will know peace was not given by the army, nor by preachers, but by a woman who stood her ground." By morning, the stone gleamed like fire under the sunrise. Word spread fast. Within hours, half the town had gathered outside the Whitmore homestead, whispering and pointing. Even those who hated him could not look away. The carving was unlike anything they'd ever seen, both savage and sacred, bold and beautiful. The preacher himself rode out, dismounting awkwardly before the slab. He brushed his fingers over the inscription. "Is this what I think it is?" he asked Clara. "It's a gift," she said quietly, "from my husband, to this land and to me." Behind her, Taza stood tall and silent, his presence commanding. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Dugan, the same woman who once crossed the street to avoid Clara, stepped forward and touched the stone surface. "It's beautiful," she murmured. The crowd murmured agreement. Slowly, suspicion turned into awe, and just like that, the town that had scorned them fell silent, not from fear, but from reverence. That night, Clara and Taza sat beside the stone, the desert wind cool and sweet around them. "Do you think they'll ever understand?" she asked. Taza smiled faintly. "In time, the land teaches slowly, but it never forgets." He reached for her hand, and together they watched the stars rise, 2 souls carved in stone and in history, forever bound by a love that had silenced a town and reshaped its heart. Peace, Clara soon learned, was never free. It demanded payment in whispers, in suspicion, and sometimes in blood. For a few blessed weeks after Taza's wedding gift stunned Red Rock, the air around town seemed lighter. No one dared insult her now. Even those who once mocked her avoided her gaze, ashamed or confused. The preacher had begun preaching forgiveness, claiming the union between a Christian woman and a native man might be the Lord's way to mend old wounds. But peace born of silence is fragile. And beneath the stillness, resentment brewed. It began with a missing horse, then 2 cattle, then a rumor that the Apache had been stealing livestock again, that they were preparing to strike back. Clara heard the talk at the well, where women gathered to draw water. "It's starting again," one whispered. "They pretend to be peaceful, but it's all a trick." Another spat into the dust. "That stone of theirs, nothing but witchcraft." Clara said nothing, but her hands trembled around the rope. She knew Taza's people too well. The Apache had no need for livestock. They hunted with respect, took only what was needed. Someone was trying to stir trouble. That night she told Taza what she'd heard. He listened silently, his face unreadable. "They wish to see the land burn again," he said at last. "Peace frightens them because it leaves them no excuse for hatred." Clara nodded. "Can we stop it?" He looked toward the mountains, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "Not always, but we can stand before it." A few days later, a messenger rode in from the sheriff's office, grim-faced, hat pulled low. "Chief Taza," he said, "the town wants a meeting. At the chapel. Tomorrow." The next morning, Taza, dressed in his ceremonial coat, the same one he'd worn the night of their forced wedding, dark hide with white eagle feathers along the shoulders. He looked regal, but there was a calm sadness about him. Clara went with him. The townsfolk had gathered outside the chapel, forming a restless circle. The sheriff stood in front, one hand on his belt. "Taza," he said carefully, "we've had trouble. Animals gone missing. Tracks near the creek, Apache moccasins by the look of them." Taza's jaw tightened. "My people have stolen nothing." From the back, a man shouted, "That's what savages always say." A murmur rose from the crowd. The air felt heavy, ready to break. Clara stepped forward before the sheriff could speak. "Enough," she cried. "If any of you had seen how his people live, you'd know they have no need for your cattle. They have honor, something this town seems to have forgotten." Her voice rang clear, silencing the murmurs. Then from the crowd, a woman, Mrs. Dugan, spoke softly. "If they didn't do it, then who did?" Taza met her eyes. "That is the right question." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "2 nights ago, I followed the trail myself. The tracks were not Apache, they were boot prints. A man dragging a cow through the dry wash. I found the brand burned off. Whoever did this meant to start war." He handed the paper to the sheriff, a signed confession written in crude script. Sheriff Harlan read it aloud, his voice faltering. "It's from Eli Turner." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Turner was one of the ranchers who had led the first attack months ago. "He confessed before he died," Taza said quietly. "He rode into our canyon, shot at my people, and was met by his own bullet, ricocheted off the stone I carved for my wife. He died by his own hate." The crowd went utterly still. Even the wind seemed to stop. Later, when the townsfolk dispersed, Clara stood beside the stone again, watching how the sunset caught in its black veins. "Will they ever stop hating?" she asked. Taza's answer came slowly. "Not all hearts can hold peace. Some must lose everything before they see truth." She took his hand, the desert wind tugging at her hair. "And what about us?" He looked down at her, eyes warm with quiet strength. "We pay the price together." That night the town bells rang, not in alarm but in respect. For the first time, Red Rock had seen what peace truly cost and who was brave enough to bear it. The blood had been spilled, yes, but not theirs. It was the blood of hatred itself, and as the stars gathered over the desert, Clara realized something profound. Her husband's greatest gift was never the stone, nor the land, but the courage to make peace when the world wanted war. The peace that followed Turner's death held steady for a while, thin as glass, delicate as silence. Days melted into weeks. Clara tended the garden, traded with the few townsfolk brave enough to meet her eyes, and helped Taza's people rebuild after the long months of distrust. The desert bloomed again that spring. Rain fell late, but when it came with power, washing away the dust of hatred, or so Clara hoped. Still, there were nights when she felt unease curling like smoke in her chest. The town might have quieted, but not every man had accepted defeat. She noticed it first in the small things. A chicken missing from the pen, footprints that weren't Taza's near the barn, the faint glint of metal by the fence line. Taza said little about it, though his eyes darkened each time he scanned the horizon. "The snake does not strike while the fire burns," he told her. It waits for darkness. It was nearly midnight when the sound came, a horse approaching fast. Clara sat up, heart pounding. Taza was already awake, reaching for his rifle. The moonlight fell sharp across his face, all calm precision and readiness. Outside, hooves struck the hard earth, then stopped. "Who's there?" Taza called out. His voice was steady, low, dangerous. A man's voice answered, slurred but familiar. "Whitmore. Come out, you damn red thief. You think a stone makes you civilized?" Clara froze. She knew that voice. Henry Cole, the ranch foreman who had always despised Taza even before the marriage. He'd been drinking that night at the saloon when word of Turner's confession spread. She remembered his eyes cold with resentment. Taza stepped out slowly, rifle lowered but ready. The moon revealed Henry on horseback, a pistol glinting in his hand. "You don't belong here," Henry spat. "You think we'll let a savage own land beside decent folk? You fooled the preacher, the sheriff, even your wife, but not me." Clara rushed to the doorway. "Henry, stop. Please, go stay back, Clara," he snapped. "You think marrying him makes you one of them? You'll die one of us, girl?" Taza's eyes narrowed. "You've drunk too much poison, Henry. Go home." Henry laughed bitterly. "Poison? You call this poison? No, what's poison is seeing you walk free, seeing her defend you like some saint. You killed Turner, now I'll—" Before he could finish, his horse reared, spooked by something unseen. The pistol went off. Clara screamed. Taza moved like lightning, knocking the gun aside. The shot tore into the ground inches from his foot. Henry fell from the saddle, cursing and scrambling for the weapon. Taza stood over him, rifle leveled. "Enough." Henry looked up, face twisted with fury and fear. "Do it," he hissed. "Shoot me. That's what you savages do." But Taza didn't pull the trigger. He lowered the rifle, his voice calm. "You are already dead, Henry. The hate inside you will finish what the bullet could not." He turned away. Henry lunged, grabbing the fallen pistol, but before he could aim, Clara swung the heavy lantern from the porch. The glass shattered against his shoulder, flames licking up his coat. Henry screamed, rolling in the dirt. By the time the sheriff and townsmen arrived, drawn by the sound, the fire was out, but so was Henry's rage. He lay sobbing in the dust, burned but alive. The sheriff looked from Henry to Taza, then to Clara. "What happened here?" Taza spoke simply. "A man came looking for death. He found Mercy instead," the sheriff nodded slowly. "Then Mercy will be your witness." By dawn, word had spread again. But this time the story was different. People whispered not of savagery but of restraint, of a man who could have killed but didn't, of a woman who defended her home not with hate, but with fire born of love. Henry Cole left Red Rock a week later, his arm bandaged, his pride broken. Some said he went north to start over. Others said he never stopped mumbling about the Apache and his angel. Either way, the town finally understood. Taza's strength wasn't in his weapon, it was in his mercy. That night, Clara and Taza stood again by the stone he'd carved, its dark surface glowing faintly under the starlight. "You could have killed him," she whispered. Taza shook his head. "No, killing ends a life. Mercy ends a war." Clara took his hand. Then maybe tonight was the last battle. He looked at her, eyes soft as the desert dawn. "No, my wife." It was the first victory, and for the first time Clara believed him. Years later, when strangers came to Red Rock and asked about the black stone by the well, the townsfolk always lowered their voices as if speaking of something sacred. By then, the story had become legend. They said an Apache warrior had carved it by hand as a gift for his young bride, a woman once scorned by her own people. They said that after that day the town was never the same again. But the truth, known only to those who had lived through it, was far more human and far more powerful. Clara stood beside the stone one warm morning, the sun spilling gold across the land her husband had given her. The cabin had grown, now 2 rooms instead of 1, with a roof that no longer leaked and a small orchard just beginning to bloom. Beside her, a little boy crouched in the dirt, tracing the carved lines of the stone with his small fingers. His hair was dark like his father's, his eyes bright like the desert sky. "Why are our names on it, Mama?" he asked. Clara smiled, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "Because your father wanted the world to remember that peace was once made here, with love, not bullets." He looked up, curious. "Was it hard to make peace?" She paused, her gaze drifting to the horizon. Yes, she said softly. The hardest thing your father ever did. The boy looked thoughtful. But he did it anyway. Yes, she whispered. He did. Taza had gone to the mountains weeks before, to speak with another Apache tribe about trade and land rights. He was expected back any day now. Clara had grown used to his absences. Each time he left, the land seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his return. She spent her days teaching their son both languages, English and Apache. You must carry both, she told him. One will open doors. The other will remind you who you are. At night, she lit the fire and told stories. Sometimes they were old Apache legends. Sometimes they were her own memories. The frightened girl who'd been forced into a marriage. The warrior who'd turned her fear into strength. The day they silenced the town with a gift carved from stone. But she never called herself brave. Only lucky. Lucky that love had found her in a place where hate once ruled. One evening, as the sunset turned the sky to fire, Clara saw a figure riding down the ridge. Her heart leapt. It was Taza. He dismounted quietly, smiling as their son ran to him. You've grown taller, he said, lifting the boy easily into his arms. And stronger, the child said proudly, flexing his little arms. Taza laughed, setting him down. His gaze met Clara's. All is well, he said. The tribes have agreed to meet the townsfolk. Trade will begin next spring. Clara's eyes widened. They'll come here? To Red Rock, he nodded. On this land. On our land. She glanced at the stone. Then your gift will be more than a memory. Taza touched the carved surface gently. No, he said. It was never a memory. It was a promise. That spring, the people of Red Rock gathered once again, not in anger but in hope. Wagons lined the field, women carrying baskets of bread, Apache riders bringing woven blankets, beads, and maize. For the first time, laughter filled the air where once there had been fear. Children from both worlds played together, chasing tumbleweeds through the dust. Clara stood beside Taza, watching the two sides mingle, and whispered, Do you think they finally see? He smiled, his hand resting over hers. They don't have to see, he said. They only have to live it. Years later, when Taza was gone and Clara's hair had turned silver, she still lived beside the stone. Travelers often stopped to ask about it, expecting a tale of battle or conquest. She would smile faintly and tell them the truth. It wasn't a gift of stone, she'd say. It was a gift of peace, and when they left, they always looked back one last time, at the black rock gleaming in the sun, the desert wind singing softly around it. In its stillness, they felt what the whole town had once learned too late, that the greatest power isn't in the sword or the gun, but in the hand that chooses to let go. The legend of the Apache's wedding gift lived on long after Clara Whitmore's. Name faded from record books, but the stone remained, standing silent in the red earth, a testament to the day love broke the silence of hatred, and a town learned that peace, like the desert, endures only through strength. And when the wind swept across it at dusk, those who listened closely could almost hear his voice again, calm and eternal. Truth must be carved, not spoken, and peace must be paid with love.